Okay, we're going to be taking a look at 3 games this morning. All were published by Against the Odds magazine, and all 3 were designed by Mike Rinella. The first game, Not War But Murder, came out in 2007 and is a simulation of the Battle of Cold Harbour. Birth of a Legend came out in 2011 and is about, of course, Lee and the 7 Days Battles. Lee's Greatest Victory, Chancellorsville, came out in 2021 and, of course, is about that great victory by Lee in 1863. All 3 games share a common system, an area movement system, with similar combat rules. And so if you learn the first game, or any one of the 3, you virtually know how to play the other 2. But there are important differences, which I'll point out in the video. Now we'll look at them in the order that they were published. So we'll go first with Not War But Murder. The title comes from a famous quote by the Confederate General D.H. Hill. He actually said, not war, but it was murder, and he was referring to the Battle of Malvern Hill, one of Lee's worst fought battles, resounding defeat for the Confederacy. So we're going to spend more time on the first title so I can show you the system and generally how it works. Then we'll take a look at the other 2 and show you some of the differences in the 3 systems. Okay, this is the general map for Not War But Murder. It shows mainly the North Anna River, the Pamunkey River here, and down at the bottom Richmond. And I'll be zooming in to that so you can see them closer. Now, I mentioned in the video that the game is about the Battle of Cold Harbour, but it's really about the campaign that took place just before Cold Harbour. Cold Harbour is at the bottom of the map. I'll show you that in a few minutes. But the game begins on May 27th, and it begins with Burnside's 9th Corps in this area. The 9th Corps, by the way, is not part of the Army of the Potomac. Grant can command it, but it isn't part of that army. The army has 3 corps. Griffin's 5th Corps, or Warren's 5th Corps rather, starts here. You've got the 2nd Corps here, and Sheridan's cavalry here. There's Grant. Again, there's the North Anna. Robert E. Lee has 3 corps, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Anderson, Early, and A.P. Hill. Hampton's cavalry is over here at Hanover Courthouse, with 1 brigade of Hampton's cavalry here on the South Anna. You can see the area is delineated, and in each area is a little circle with an identifier number and a number below, which is the terrain defense. That's going to be important when you're calculating combat. You can see entrenchments here. There are 2 levels of entrenchments. You can see this one with 2 symbols, means they're heavily entrenched, and lighter entrenchments. So that's the way the game begins. Lee heavily entrenched on the south side of the North Anna, with the Union Army a small foothold on the south side. The game generally comes down to outflanking Lee's impregnable positions and eventually trying to get down to Richmond. And I'll show you the lower half of the map now. Okay, we can see Hampton's cavalry here. Again, the Pamunkey and the South Anna. And I'll generally pan down. The heavy line you see here, the red line, is the railroad, of course, the Virginia Central. And here's Richmond and its outer defenses. Now, the Battle of Cold Harbour actually took place over here. Cold Harbour, New Cold Harbour, and that's the Chickahominy, where, of course, the 7 Days Battles took place. There's Fair Oaks, Seven Pines, and Savage Station. So you've got quite a lot of room to maneuver in this game, and this is very much a maneuver game. Okay, we'll look briefly at the sequence of play, since it is generally the same for all 3 games. There are some differences. It begins with the dawn phase, Both players would flip any inactive leader markers back to their active side. Then you'd place any reinforcements to come on the board, replacements. Then you do this Lee's health die roll. And that will result in Lee either being healthy or unhealthy. Now during this campaign, Robert E. Lee was already beginning to show the symptoms of the disease that would eventually kill him. He died of a heart attack in around 1870, I believe. So Lee's health is important in this game. As to whether he's on the board or not will make a difference in the movement. Then you go to this daylight phase where players will alternate impulses. Union player, Confederate player, Union player, Confederate player, back and forth. Each person will be able to do one pulse or activate one area. On turn 1, the Union will go first. On every subsequent turn, Lee will move first. When all the players have moved and there's no more active units left, you can pass, by the way, you're going to eventually go to the night phase. Now the game can go or end early with this special sunset die roll. To simplify it down at a certain point of the game, as the number of pulses goes by, the chance of the day ending will increase. In the night phase, you kind of do that stuff we're kind of used to, where you clean up the units, allocate replacement points. Exhausted artillery units are flipped back to fresh. And then you have this end phase. Check for automatic victory conditions. You can lay entrenchments and so on. So that's the general sequence of play. Let's see how movement works. Okay, looking at the counters themselves, you can see the attack value on the left. In the middle is the defense value, and that's the movement value. So let's say, for the sake of argument, the Union player decided to activate Area 4. See the 4 there? And these are the units. Now, I've spread out the units because I like to be able to see them all, and it's just more visually pleasing to me. But sometimes when the areas are very small, you're going to have to stack them. There's just no way of getting around it. The areas are small. As a rule of thumb, it's not a rule, but it's a good idea to have your artillery on the top. And you'll see in a moment why. It's because it's the positions of artillery that influence the movement of enemy units. Now, because it's an area movement system, it's got an interesting table for the costs. I'll just go through those so you'll understand what's happening in the video. Generally, it costs you 1 movement point to enter a vacant area. So, if Torbert's cavalry was here and he moved to St. Paul's Church, that's 1 movement point. Entering a vacant area adjacent to a fresh enemy artillery unit. Now, this is very important. Matter of fact, it's key to the movement in this game. So, for example, if Torbert was here and he wanted to move to Area 6, it would cost him actually 2. Because 1, its Concord Church costs him 1, but because he's going adjacent to an enemy artillery unit right here, dominating, he pays 2 movement points. Then he could continue on 3 and 4 and so on off the board. So that's very important. The proximity of enemy artillery affects your movement. Now, if you enter an area containing a fresh enemy unit, you pay 4. So I'll just make up a scenario here. Let's say we had Ramsar here. That it wouldn't happen. I don't see Ramsar ever getting up there. But if Torbert wanted to enter that area, he'd pay 4. 4 movement points just to enter that area. So entering an area with enemy units is expensive. Crossing a creek without using a bridge, infantry and cavalry only, you'd move It would take all your movement points to cross a creek, except if there's a bridge. Of course, you only pay 1. So watch out for that. And to enter a contested area where the defender has units that are all exhausted, it only costs 1. And if you enter a contested area that has at least 1 fresh defender, it costs 2. A contested area is an area where enemy units are both existing at the same time. So it's the status of whether they're fresh or upside down, and whether they're in a contested area will greatly affect the movement of the units. And this is where gameplay and finesse and the positioning of your units is all important, and especially where your fresh artillery units are located. Okay, here I'm going to show you a simple combat example. Let's say, for the sake of argument, Hancock activated Area 12, and he wants to move into McDowell's Mill. Well, we've already looked at the cost. It costs you 4 movement factors to enter that area. So these divisions go in, back these up a little bit, and this is what's confronting the Confederates. Now, you often run out of space, so what I do is take a little wee battle marker, which I took from another game, and I put this battle marker in the area to remind myself where the battle took place. Then I can spread the units out and see what I'm dealing with. Of course, you don't have to do that. Depends how many units you have. Alright. So, you want to now calculate the attack value for the attacker. And what he does is he picks a point unit and uses that attack value. So we'll say that Potter is the lead unit, point unit, and he's got 4 movement factors. Then you're allowed to add 1 for each fresh infantry. So 2 plus 2 is 6. They get to add 2 more for artillery, 8, and for each exhausted unit, 1. So he's got an attack value of 9. Now we do a similar situation for the Confederates, but it's slightly different. We take the defense factor of the forward unit, they call it, 6. We add 1 for each fresh infantry and cavalry participating, 2, and 1 for each artillery, 3. We have a level 1 entrenchment, which is 4, and you get to add the defense value here, which is 2. So it should be 6. Okay, so it's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So the total defense factor for the Confederates is 11. So you subtract the higher from the lower, and you get the net modifier. So 11 minus 9 is 2. So when the Confederates roll their 2 dice, they'll have adding 2 to their dice. When the Union rolls, it'll be just basic. So you'll roll the dice, and then you'll go from there. Let's roll the dice in this attack and see what happens. Okay, rolling. Okay, this is not going to be too good for the Union. Okay, the Confederates get to add 2 to their dice, so they've really rolled a 12, and the Union has rolled a 6. So the Confederates have won the battle by +6. They now have to take off, the Union, casualty points. And this is your scale. Each fresh unit exhausted costs you 1. Each fresh unit eliminated costs you 3. Each exhausted unit that retreats costs you 1. A fresh unit may be exhausted and then retreated for a total of 2 CP. Each exhausted unit eliminated is 2. So within the parameters there, the Union will take losses and decide what he wants to do. I'll just give you one example of what he could do. Remember, the Union unit can take 1 casualty point for each fresh unit exhausted. So he's got 4 units. So he could do it this way. Here's 4 units exhausted. Now he has to make up 2 more casualty points. So he can take 1 CP for each exhausted unit that retreats. So we can retreat the artillery out of McDowell's Mill back to there, take this guy back there, and he will remain in the area like that. And the Confederates take no losses. So we have a bloody repulse in that particular battle at McDowell's Mill. Now, of course, there are all kinds of possibilities depending on how many units you have, how many are fresh, what the final modifier is, and that's where the meat of the game is for the combat. It's this combination of maneuver and combat that makes this a very interesting game. Now there's a very important rule which appears in several of the games. It's called the advantage. One player begins the game with the advantage. In this case, it's the Union player. And you use that, you put that on the turn record to remind you that the Union has the advantage. If the advantage changes, and that's always voluntary, by the way, you'd flip it to the Confederate side, and then Lee would have the advantage. If Lee used the advantage, it would then revert back to the Union. What does the advantage mean? Well, it's listed on this little wee table here. Robert E. Lee, or the Confederates, can change the Lee's health die roll by using the advantage. You could use it for that. You could also use it to rally units. Sometimes you might want to do that. But the important one is this one here, activate 2 areas. During the daylight phase, if you use the advantage, you can activate 2 areas, and that can be very big. Or the last one is you could use it to increase your night replacements. You might be in a desperate situation where you need to reflip units. You might want to give the advantage. So the advantage isn't a random thing. It's something that you give up and give to the enemy player. And that can change back and forth, especially in some of the later games like Chancellorsville. Now there are some advanced rules for building bridges and other things. I didn't use them right away. I'm still playing with the basic game. Force marching, things like that. It's a good game. Now, in corresponding with Michael, I wanted to know what he was trying to achieve with this series, because I bought all 3 of them as they came out, and he told me that his objective was really to do a game you could play in an evening, several hours, do a good campaign, and not be overburdened with rules and complications. So it's not Terrible Swift Sword or Last Chance for Victory or anything like that. It's a simple game, but it's pretty good history. I like it. It's fun to play. One thing I like too is it's easy to set up. There isn't a lot of counters. Now in this particular game, I played it a couple of times with an opponent and several times solitaire. I found that generally the Union kind of wants to keep moving to his left, outflanking Lee out of each successive position, eventually getting across the Pamunkey here and threatening Richmond. You win by casualties, geographical territory, and that's the way you win. Is it balanced? I don't know. I haven't played it enough to know if it's balanced. Play balance is not a big thing for me anyway. I want to study the campaign, so the Union probably should win the battle of the campaign here, but it's balanced in the sense that maybe the Union has the numbers and they're more mobile, but they've got more replacements than Lee. Lee's army is finite. If he takes casualties, you can't really replace them. So there's much more to the game having to do with the pulses and how the game can end early. But I wanted to give you an overview of the system before we take a look at the next one, which will be Birth of a Legend, Robert E. Lee. So that's it for Not War But Murder. Now the situation for Birth of a Legend, which is the 7 Days Battles campaign, is entirely different than Not War But Murder. Of course, this takes place in the summer of '62, and in this situation, General McClellan has got his army to within 4 miles of Richmond, a remarkable feat when you really think about it. If McClellan had not lost the initiative, who knows how the campaign would have turned out. And we will zoom in a little bit here. And the map orientation is different than last time. Now we're looking east. So north is to the left, east is the top, and west is at the bottom of the screen. So there we have the city of Richmond there, and Lee's lines just outside the city on the left there. Meadowbridge, Magruder's forces, Pendleton, Thomas, stretching down to the Cornelius Creek at Chaffin's Bluff. As you can see, McClellan's army is closing right in. I remember reading at the time that the Union Army could set their watches by the sound of the clocks in Richmond. That's how close McClellan got. Now in real life, of course, Jackson's corps came in from the north, joining up with Lee's force attacking Porter's 5th Corps, isolated on the other side of the Chickahominy. So Lee, taking the initiative, tried to crush McClellan's right flank. It's a very interesting situation. Now McClellan's supply line is at the back there. You can see those 3 units at the White House. That's his supply line. And there's all kinds of rules for McClellan moving his base from White House Landing to the James, where he eventually did move his supply line down here, Harrison's Landing. So it's an entirely different situation. Except the Union Army is close to the city, and the Confederates pretty well have to go on the offensive to throw McClellan back. Now, like the other game, Not War But Murder, the phases are similar. You've got a dawn phase, the daylight phase, you've got your sunset die roll again, and a night phase, and then the end phase. You'll notice that there's no rolling for Lee's health phase in this particular game. Now, lest one gets horrified for me marking up the booklet, don't worry about that. I always work from copies anyway. This is a copy of the rules. So the important differences in this game are the geographical costs for movement, and you'll see some differences from Not War But Murder. In this game, it's 1 movement factor to enter a vacant area, just like the other game. But this one is different. Enter a vacant area adjacent to a fresh enemy artillery unit is 2. That's an adjacent. That's to actually enter the area. That's different. Then there's enter an area containing only exhausted units is 3 movement factors. Enter an area containing a fresh enemy unit, 4 movement factors, like the other game. Notice there's nothing about artillery here, and long range and adjacent. It's quite different. Cross any area boundary without moving along a road takes all your movement factors. And a contested area costs you 1 movement factor. And a contested area activation for all units, if there is at least 1 fresh defender in the active area, costs you 2. So this is what makes the movement in Birth of a Legend different than Not War But Murder. Those movement costs do make a difference. They've got cavalry screening rules. Even the other game had that. I didn't explain that in the first part of the video. but cavalry can fall back automatically before infantry. So in principle, the games are very similar. The differences are in the costs for movement, and that's where the game changes greatly. Now, I've played this one several times. I like the situation, and we often find Jackson coming in here, kind of outflanking Porter's 5th Corps, and McClellan kind of falling back. He usually does try to evacuate his supply line down to Harrison's Landing. But that's just my experience with the game. Other players might have tried just, going all-out assault on Richmond right from the front. Don't know if that's successful or not. Maybe trying to move a corps here. But it's a very dynamic situation. There are advanced rules for getting gunboats in there. And there's a siege gun optional rule too. You can get siege guns close to Richmond, which makes a difference. And I don't know, overall, I really like Birth of a Legend, taking place in 1862. So by the way, with the 3 titles, you're getting a major campaign for each of the 3 major years of the war. 62, Birth of a Legend, 63, Chancellorsville, and 64, not war but murder. So this game's got a nice map too. The terrain interpretation is much the same as the others. You add the terrain defense when you attack it. The attack and defense values are slightly different than the other 2. You can see some slight differences here in the way attacks are calculated. The attacking factor of any one assaulting unit, the point unit, just like the other game. The combat rating of any activated subordinate leader, that was missing in the first game. +2 for each additional fresh infantry participating, that was pretty well the same. +1 for each friendly cavalry and artillery, similar to the other game. 1 for each exhausted infantry. And -1 for each additional command ID participating beyond the first. So if you're mixing corps, you're going to get a penalty. And -1 if McClellan is inactive. That's sort of like the Lee's health rule. You're going to be rolling to see if McClellan is active in the campaign. So that are some differences between this game and the other one. Now for defense, let's see what the differences are there. Yeah, for defense, you're going to take the lead unit again. Then you're going to add 1 for each fresh infantry, cavalry, and artillery, which is different than the attacker. Then you're going to add the terrain. And if any of the attacking units are crossing a minor water boundary, you'll get an extra addition there. +1 or +2 for entrenchments. And -1 if the Union defense, if the supply train is not in the White House landing. So there's an incentive for McClellan to not move his supply line if he can help it. So those are the major differences. Little wee things you just have to remember when you're playing a different game in the series. So we'll leave Birth of a Legend, and now we'll take a look at Chancellorsville. Okay, with Lee's greatest victory, Chancellorsville, we have a horse of a different color entirely. For one thing, the Battle of Chancellorsville, or the Campaign of Chancellorsville, is a very difficult one to simulate in a war game. It's been done several times before. For those of you who are familiar with my videos, you could take a look at my review of the way Avalon Hill did it way back in 1961. They came up with a Chancellorsville game, and it was later redone and reprinted in 1974. So there are always special problems about doing a game on Chancellorsville, and we'll get into that a little bit before I explain the game itself. For one thing, Lee in this battle is outnumbered literally 2-1. Hooker's army is twice the size of Lee's. That's because one of his corps commanders, General Longstreet, along with 2 divisions, is or was engaged in the Suffolk, Virginia area and was not available by the time Hooker moved. It's one of the few times that Robert E. Lee was taken by surprise. Hooker came up with a brilliant plan, and if you want to understand the Battle of Chancellorsville, I highly recommend Stephen Sears' book on that subject. It's a very, very good book. Hooker's plan was brilliant, and it was exercised brilliantly too. The opening moves of the campaign are just fascinating to read about. Now the game begins on April 30th, and it already begins with Hooker having moved 3 corps upriver. He's already moved the 11th Corps here and the 12th Corps under Slocum to this off-board section west of the Wilderness Tavern. Meade's 5th Corps is here at Ely's Ford, ready to cross, and he's got Couch's 2nd Corps at Scott's Ford, ready to cross. He's got engineer units, which you can use to build bridges to facilitate movement. These are all fords, which you can cross at. If you use a ford, you can only cross with 1 unit at a time. If you build a pontoon bridge, which you have several, you can cross with 5 units. Now I'm not going to go over the movement system again. It's the same as the other two. Again, with small little differences, which I'll show you. But it's still the same game system. But what made Lee's victory so great, of course, was the fact that he moved troops without Hooker knowing exactly where they were. And in any game where you can see every single counter on the board, this is going to be almost impossible to achieve. All the Chancellorsville games have had that problem. So, if you're the Union player and you see Lee's men just pick up and start moving west, well, you can see that. Unless you have a game with hidden dummy units and hidden movement. Like I said, Chancellorsville is very hard to simulate. So how did the designer get around that dilemma with this system? Well, he did it in a very clever way, and he modified the advantage rule. And he did that by, when you seize the advantage, you can move, you're doing these pulse turns. Remember, Union, Confederate, Union, Confederate, Union, Confederate? In this game, it's different. You can get a whole bunch of pulses all in a row when you seize the initiative. And there's a little table you roll. Each time you take a pulse, there's less and less chance you're going to be able to complete the final pulse. So that's how you simulate the initiative in this game. If you get a bunch of pulses back to back, you can really make some headway. Now when I played this solitaire the first time, I had a heck of a time winning as the Union player. I just could not get them to win. So a friend and I tried a face-to-face game. He took the Union, and I took the Confederate, and I easily won a Confederate victory, playing very passively, and the Union just had a hard time to win. We didn't quite like rule number 13, the advantage. We thought there was something a little wonky about it. But I still had faith in the game, so I decided to do some more exploration. So I played solitaire several times more. Then I realized that the key to the Union having a chance to win is in those initial turns, on turn 1, when you have the initiative. When you've got the initiative, you use it. And I came up with a plan whereby the 11th and 12th Corps crossed the river along with the 5th. The 2nd started crossing. And once they'd become all exhausted, I used the initiative to flip them all up and then move again. And this was sort of the key to getting the Union offensive going. Now, when you give up the advantage in this game, you automatically give it to the Confederates. And this is, well, I find it very hard to even still win as Union. Because once Lee gets going and he seizes the initiative, boy, he can get going. So that's the way the designer handled the hidden movement aspect of the campaign, by seizing the initiative. And if I've learned anything in this game is, if you've got the initiative, you'd better use it, because that's the only way you're going to be able to dominate the combats against your enemy. Okay, so what are the differences in the movement costs in this particular title? Well, it's still the old enter a vacant area, 1 movement point. And if you enter a vacant area adjacent to a fresh enemy unit, it's 2 movement points. And if you enter an area containing only exhausted enemy units, it's 3 movement points. Again, enter an area containing a fresh enemy unit, 4 movement points. And if you want to assault within a contested area, use all your movement points. So it's a little different than not war but murder, and a little different than Birth of a Legend. This took some getting used to, but once you get it, you get the hang of it. You can see that artillery units are not as important as in Not War but Murder. Also not as important, I found, was in Not War but Murder, there was an incentive to keep your cores in their core structure. Here it's not as important. All the units in an area can usually move when you activate them. Now the attack factor in this version of the game is radically different than the other two. I mean, it's easily recognizable, but it is different. You still take the attack factor of any one attacking unit, and you add 1 for each participating unit in the attack if you're Confederate. But you add 2 if you're Union. Each supporting artillery unit is 1. And if you surprise attack, that is, you attack a guy in a wilderness area, you're going to get an advantage, not a disadvantage. You also get 1 for a command integrity bonus. For every time you have 3 units from the same corps, you're going to get to add 1. So there is an incentive to keep in corps and division structure. And they have leadership in here. If you want to lead from the front, you get another +2 if you're Lee, Jackson, or Stewart, +1 if you're any other commander. So you can see there's different parameters for the attack in this game. What's the defense like? Okay, once again, I'm working from copies here. That's a copy of the rules, and I just yellow in stuff so I can remember them. The defender gets to take the defense factor of 1 defending unit, and he gets to add 1 for each defending non-leader. They don't mention artillery or cavalry, doesn't matter. Plus you get the terrain, of course. And if the attacker is making a mandatory attack, you're going to get +1. And if you have a leader present, again, +1. And 1 or 2 if you've got an entrenchment. So these factors add up. And with the Confederates being on the defensive, that's kind of handy. Now, how did that work out in practice? Well, I've got a lot of games under my belt of this now too, and I'm still trying to figure out how the Union can win this. And I began to get suspicious about the order of battle, because I know this order of battle fairly well. And when I began adding up factors, Union factors and Confederate, I found, much to my surprise, that the Union did not outnumber the Confederates 2-1. So I was wondering how the designer was getting around that. And then I began to study the initiative system better, and I corresponded with Michael too. And I saw his logic and reason for it. His overall aim in the series was to make some Civil War games that can be played in an evening, several hours, and have a lot of fun and still have a respect for history. But I couldn't reconcile myself with that darn order of battle. So I began to study the initiative system and the combat system. And as Mike explained, the combat system, being simple, can give a wide range of factors. For example, if you roll a 12 on the attack and the defender rolls a 2, difference of 10, that's going to be a lot of casualties to account for. So there's huge swings of luck in this. So if you wanted to, let's say, simulate Lee's boldness at Chancellorsville, in game terms, it would be the equivalent of getting the initiative, using it, hitting hard, hitting fast, and getting fairly lucky. And I'm okay with that. I still think this is a pretty good simulation of the Battle of the Chancellorsville. And I've got lots of strategies left to explore. I haven't tried yet having the Union maybe come across here, just come crashing across at Hamilton's Crossing and just try to bash your way through. I still think the best way is to use Hooker's plan, come up here behind Lee and move east. So Chancellorsville might be the odd child of the series of 3, but it's still a fine game in its own right. Now, having looked at all 3 games, that might beg the question, well, will there be any others in the series? Well, of course, that's up to Mike, I guess, and ATO. For one, what would I like to see as a 4th title? Right now he's got 3 years covered, 62, 63, 64. I'm not sure if the system would be applicable to many Civil War campaigns. For example, I would not want to see a game using this system for Battle of Gettysburg. I don't see it. They're better at the operational scale. Antietam, another battle I like to study a lot, I don't think would be good on this system either. You need more wide open spaces to make this system work. Chancellorsville, Not War But Murder, Birth of Legend, I think the maps there cover that fairly well. I think perhaps a game on Vicksburg would be interesting at this scale. But we'll just have to, remains to be seen whether there will be any more titles in this series. But these 3 games I really like. So that's my summation of the 3 games, Not War But Murder, Birth of a Nation, and Lee's Greatest Victory. And as always, thank you for watching.